The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as 17-year-old Zoe walked home from her karate class. Her black belt was neatly folded in her gym bag, along with her sweaty uniform and water bottle. She had just finished teaching a group of younger kids their basic moves, something she did every Tuesday and Thursday to help pay for her own training. Zoe loved these quiet walks home. It gave her time to think about her upcoming college applications and her dream of studying law. Her parents always told her that education was the key to breaking barriers, and she believed them wholeheartedly. As the daughter of a nurse and a mechanic, she knew that hard work and determination were the only ways to achieve her goals. The sound of a police car slowing down behind her made Zoe glance over her shoulder. She didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were common in their neighborhood, and she had never had any trouble with law enforcement before. She continued walking, her mind still focused on the essay she needed to finish for her college application. The police car pulled up beside her, and the window rolled down. Officer Rick Morrison leaned out, his eyes scanning Zoe from head to toe with an expression that made her uncomfortable. She had seen that look before, the kind that made assumptions based on nothing more than the color of her skin. "Hey you, stop right there," Morrison called out, his voice carrying an authority that seemed unnecessarily harsh for a simple interaction. Zoe stopped walking and turned to face the officer, her hands visible and her posture respectful. Her parents had given her the talk years ago about how to behave around police officers. Keep your hands where they can see them. Speak clearly and politely. Don't make sudden movements. Follow instructions exactly. Good afternoon, officer. Is there something I can help you with? Zoe asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Morrison got out of his car, his hand resting casually on his belt near his weapon. I've been getting reports about suspicious activity in this area. Someone matching your description has been casing houses looking for opportunities to break in. Zoe felt her heart skip a beat. She had been walking this same route home from the dojo for 3 years. Every shop owner knew her. Every neighbor had seen her pass by countless times. The accusation was not only false but insulting. I think there's been a misunderstanding, officer. I live just 4 blocks from here and I was walking home from my karate class at Master Kim's studio. I can show you my student ID if you'd like. Morrison's expression darkened. I didn't ask for your life story, girl. I asked you to explain what you're doing skulking around this neighborhood. The word skulking hit Zoe like a slap. She had been walking normally, minding her own business, carrying a gym bag and wearing her school hoodie. There was nothing suspicious about her behavior, and she knew it. More importantly, she knew that Morrison knew it too. Officer, I understand you're just doing your job, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a straight-A student at Lincoln High, and I've never been in any kind of trouble. If you need to verify my identity, I'm happy to cooperate. Zoe reached slowly into her backpack to retrieve her student ID, making sure to announce her movements clearly. But Morrison stepped forward aggressively, his voice rising. Don't reach for anything. Keep your hands where I can see them. Several passers-by had begun to notice the commotion. Mrs. Patterson from the corner house stepped out onto her porch, recognizing Zoe as the polite young woman who always waved hello. A few teenagers across the street stopped to watch, their phones already in their hands. Zoe immediately raised her hands, her student ID still clutched in her fingers. I'm sorry, officer. I was just trying to show you my identification like you asked. I never asked for anything, Morrison snapped, though they both knew he had implied it. Turn around and put your hands on the hood of my car. This was escalating far beyond what Zoe had expected. She knew her rights, but she also knew that arguing with a police officer on the street rarely ended well for people who looked like her. She complied with the request, placing her hands flat on the warm metal of the patrol car. Morrison began searching her bag roughly, dumping out her karate uniform, her textbooks, and her water bottle onto the sidewalk. He seemed frustrated that he wasn't finding anything incriminating. The small crowd of onlookers was growing, and Zoe could hear murmurs of disapproval from people who knew her. This is harassment, called out a voice from the crowd. That girl hasn't done anything wrong. Morrison spun around, his face red with anger. Everyone back off. This is police business, and I don't need commentary from the peanut gallery. But the crowd didn't disperse. Instead, more people came out of their houses and shops. They knew Zoe. She had helped Mrs. Chen carry groceries when her arthritis was acting up. She had taught self-defense basics to the Rivera girls when they were being bullied at school. She had organized a fundraiser when the Martinez family lost their home in a fire. One of the teenagers, a kid named Devin who Zoe had tutored in math, had started recording with his phone. He was smart enough to stay far enough back that Morrison couldn't easily stop him, but close enough that his camera could capture everything. "You got no right to treat her like this," Devin called out. "She helps everybody in this neighborhood. She ain't done nothing wrong." Morrison's frustration was evident. He had expected a quick stop that would result in either finding something incriminating or scaring Zoe enough that she would avoid the area in the future. Instead, he was facing a hostile crowd that knew and respected the young woman he was harassing. "I said back off," Morrison shouted, his hand moving toward his weapon in a gesture that sent a chill through the crowd. Zoe felt the tension escalating dangerously. She could sense that Morrison was feeling cornered and humiliated, which made him unpredictable. Her karate training had taught her to read body language and energy, and everything about Morrison's posture screamed that he was about to do something reckless. "Officer Morrison," she said quietly, reading his name tag, "I think we can resolve this peacefully. I understand you're trying to keep the neighborhood safe, and I appreciate that. But I really am just a student walking home from class." Her calm, respectful tone seemed to infuriate Morrison even more. "Don't you dare tell me how to do my job, you little—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but everyone present could fill in the blank. The ugly word hung in the air unspoken but clearly understood. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly from her porch, and Devin's phone captured every moment of the exchange. Morrison grabbed Zoe's arm roughly, spinning her around to face him. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you're better than everyone else around here?" "I never said that, sir. I just—" "Shut up!" Morrison's voice was now loud enough that people 3 blocks away could hear him. "I'm sick of you people thinking you can just walk around wherever you want, acting like you own the place." The mask was completely off now. This had never been about suspicious activity or keeping the neighborhood safe. This was about a man with a badge and a gun who couldn't stand the sight of a confident, educated young black woman walking through what he apparently considered his territory. Zoe's training kicked in, but not the physical kind. Her sensei had taught her that true martial arts wasn't about fighting, but about maintaining control of yourself and the situation. She took a deep breath and centered herself, refusing to let Morrison's hatred contaminate her energy. "Officer, I respect your authority, but I also know my rights. If you're not arresting me for a specific crime, then I'm free to go. If you are arresting me, then I need to know what I'm being charged with, and I'd like to call my parents." Her clear, articulate response in front of witnesses was the last thing Morrison wanted to hear. He was trapped in a situation of his own making, surrounded by people who knew he was wrong, being recorded by multiple phones, and facing a teenager who was handling the situation with more professionalism than he was. That's when Morrison made the decision that would change both of their lives forever. Instead of backing down or finding a way to end the encounter gracefully, he decided to assert his authority in the most brutal way possible. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and disorderly conduct," he announced, reaching for his handcuffs. The crowd erupted in protest, but Zoe remained calm. She knew this was illegal, but she also knew that fighting it on the street would only make things worse. As Morrison roughly cuffed her hands behind her back, Devin's phone captured every second of the injustice unfolding on Maple Street. What Morrison didn't know was that this moment would haunt him for the rest of his career. And what Zoe didn't know was that her calm strength in the face of hatred was about to inspire a movement that would change everything. The video hit social media within an hour of Zoe's arrest. Devin had uploaded it to every platform he could think of, and it spread like wildfire through the community. By the time Zoe's parents, David and Patricia, arrived at the police station to bail out their daughter, justice for Zoe was already trending locally. Patricia's hands shook as she watched the video on her phone in the police station waiting room. 23 years of marriage to David, a black man who worked as a mechanic, had taught her about the daily realities of racism. But seeing her own daughter, T, rated like a criminal for the crime of walking home from karate class made her physically ill. "This can't be happening," she whispered to David, who was pacing the small waiting area like a caged animal. "She was just walking home. She's never even had a detention at school." David had seen the video 3 times already, and each viewing made him angrier. But he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that any display of emotion in a police station could be twisted against them later. He had learned that lesson the hard way during his own encounters with law enforcement over the years. When Zoe finally emerged from the holding area, she looked smaller than usual, but unbroken. Her parents hugged her tightly, and Patricia couldn't stop the tears that had been building up for hours. "I'm okay, Mom," Zoe said softly. "They didn't hurt me, but we need to do something about this. What Officer Morrison did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal." The family drove home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But by the time they reached their modest two-story house, their phone was already ringing. Word had spread through their church, David's union, and Patricia's hospital colleagues. Everyone wanted to know if Zoe was okay and what they could do to help. The first call that really mattered came from attorney Lisa Rodriguez, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in police misconduct cases. She had seen the video and wanted to meet with the family as soon as possible. "Cases like this are what I live for," Rodriguez explained when they met at her downtown office the next morning. "The video evidence is crystal clear. Officer Morrison violated your daughter's Fourth Amendment rights, used excessive force, and made an arrest without probable cause. But more than that, his language and behavior suggest this was racially motivated." Rodriguez had done her homework overnight. She pulled out a thick file that made David's heart sink. Officer Morrison has been the subject of 17 citizen complaints over the past 8 years. 5 of those involved excessive force and 12 involved allegations of racial bias. The department has investigated every single complaint and found no wrongdoing. Zoe leaned forward in her chair. "How is that possible? 17 complaints and nothing happened?" "Welcome to the reality of police accountability," Rodriguez said grimly. "Internal affairs investigations are conducted by police officers investigating other police officers. They rarely result in discipline unless there's overwhelming evidence and public pressure. That's why the video is so important. But there was a problem. When Rodriguez requested Morrison's body camera footage from the incident, she was told that it had malfunctioned. The audio was corrupted, and the video showed only static during the crucial 15 minutes of Zoe's arrest." "Convenient," David muttered. "How often do these cameras malfunction?" Rodriguez smiled grimly. "You'd be amazed. But here's the thing. We don't need their footage because we have something better. We have multiple witnesses and clear video shot by civilians. That's actually more credible than police footage because it can't be edited or controlled by the department." The lawyer explained their options. They could file a civil lawsuit seeking monetary damages for Zoe's treatment. They could also file complaints with the state attorney general's office and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Most importantly, they could push for criminal charges against Morrison. "I want all of it," Zoe said firmly. "This isn't just about me. If Officer Morrison has done this 17 times before, how many other people has he hurt who didn't have video evidence? How many people were too scared to come forward?" Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. But I need to warn you, this is going to get ugly. Morrison's union will provide him with expensive lawyers who will try to destroy your reputation. They'll dig up every mistake you've ever made, question your character, and try to paint you as the aggressor." Patricia felt her protective instincts flare. She's 17 years old. She's an honor student who teaches karate to little kids and volunteers at the community center. What could they possibly say about her? "They'll find something," Rodriguez said sadly. "They always do. Maybe a social media post that can be taken out of context, or a teacher who remembers her arguing about a grade, or a time she was late for curfew. They'll make her sound like a habitual troublemaker who was probably up to no good." But Rodriguez had underestimated the power of community support. By the end of the week, Devon's video had been viewed over 2 million times. Local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly everyone wanted to interview the family. The first breakthrough came when Channel 7's investigative reporter, Mike Chen, decided to dig deeper into Morrison's record. What he found was even worse than Rodriguez had discovered. Morrison had been involved in 3 previous incidents that resulted in the city paying out settlements to victims. The total cost to taxpayers was over $400,000, but Morrison had never faced any discipline. "The pattern is clear," Chen reported on the evening news. "Officer Morrison has cost the city hundreds of thousands of dollars in settlements, but he's still on the street with a badge and a gun. Citizens are asking why." The second breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Ray Williams, a 20-year veteran of the force, watched the video and was disgusted by what he saw. Williams was one of the few black officers in the department, and he had watched Morrison's behavior for years with growing concern. Williams reached out to Rodriguez through a mutual contact. He couldn't testify publicly without risking his career, but he could provide information about Morrison's history and the department's pattern of covering up misconduct. Morrison has been a problem for years, Williams told Rodriguez during a secret meeting in a coffee shop across town. He's got friends in high places who protect him. But this video is different. This time there's no way to explain it away. Williams provided Rodriguez with a list of other Morrison victims who had been too intimidated to come forward. Some were undocumented immigrants who feared deportation. Others were people with criminal records who didn't think anyone would believe them. Still others were just regular citizens who didn't want the hassle of fighting the police department. Rodriguez began reaching out to these victims, and slowly, a pattern emerged. Morrison specifically targeted people of color, especially young black men and women. He used traffic stops and suspicious activity checks as pretexts to harass and intimidate people he didn't think belonged in certain neighborhoods. The third breakthrough came when Master Kim, Zoe's karate instructor, organized a peaceful protest outside the police department. Over 500 people showed up, including many of Morrison's previous victims who finally felt safe enough to speak out. Kim had immigrated from South Korea 20 years earlier and had built his karate studio into a community institution. He was respected by people of all backgrounds, and his support for Zoe carried significant weight. "This young woman represents everything good about our community," Kim told the crowd through a megaphone. "She is disciplined, respectful, hardworking, and kind. The fact that she was treated like a criminal for walking home from my studio is an insult to every parent who sends their child to learn from me." The crowd included Zoe's classmates, her parents' co-workers, members of their church, and dozens of children who had learned karate from her. But it also included people who had never met Zoe, but were outraged by what they had seen on the video. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed Zoe's arrest, gave a particularly powerful speech. "I've lived on Maple Street for 43 years, she told the crowd. "I've watched that girl grow up. She shovels my sidewalk in winter without being asked. She helps me carry groceries when my arthritis is bad. She's never been anything but respectful and kind. What Officer Morrison did to her was wrong, and everyone in our neighborhood knows it." The protest was covered by every local news station and several national outlets. The image of hundreds of people of all ages and backgrounds standing together for justice was powerful. And it put even more pressure on city officials to take action. Mayor Thompson, who had initially defended Morrison with vague statements about supporting law enforcement, found himself facing a public relations nightmare. Phone calls and emails flooded City Hall, demanding Morrison's arrest and prosecution. The final straw came when the state attorney general's office announced they were opening their own investigation into Morrison's conduct and the police department's handling of previous complaints against him. Federal investigators also began looking into whether Morrison's actions violated Zoe's civil rights. Police Chief Anderson, who had been Morrison's protector for years, suddenly found himself in an impossible position. The video evidence was undeniable, the public pressure was intense, and his own officers were beginning to question the department's credibility. 3 weeks after Zoe's arrest, Morrison was suspended without pay pending a full investigation. The department also announced that they were reviewing all previous complaints against him with fresh eyes. But for Zoe and her family, the suspension felt like too little, too late. They wanted Morrison charged with a crime, not just suspended from his job. They wanted systemic changes that would prevent other families from going through what they had experienced. "This is just the beginning," Rodriguez told them as they prepare. "Ed, for the legal battle ahead, suspension is a good first step, but real justice means making sure Morrison faces the same consequences any civilian would face for assaulting a teenager." As they left Rodriguez's office that day, Zoe felt a mixture of hope and determination. The video had shown the world what really happened on Maple Street, and the community's response had been overwhelming. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Morrison had powerful allies and expensive lawyers, and they would fight back hard. Still, Zoe felt ready for the challenge. Her karate training had taught her that the most important battles were often the longest ones, requiring patience, discipline, and unwavering focus on the goal. Justice for herself was important, But justice for Morrison's other victims and prevention of future abuse was even more important. The real fight was just beginning. 6 months after that afternoon on Maple Street, Zoe found herself walking up the steps of the county courthouse for the beginning of Rick Morrison's criminal trial. The district attorney had finally decided to press charges after overwhelming public pressure and the emergence of additional victims willing to testify. The charges were serious: assault and battery, violation of civil rights under color of law, and filing a false police report. If convicted on all counts, Morrison could face up to 8 years in prison and would never be allowed to work in law enforcement again. Zoe's parents flanked her on either side as they navigated through the crowd of reporters and supporters gathered outside the courthouse. The case had attracted national attention, becoming a symbol of the ongoing struggle for police accountability and racial justice. "Zoe, can you tell us how you're feeling about the trial?" shouted a reporter from CNN. Attorney Rodriguez stepped in smoothly. "Ms. Thompson will not be making any statements to the media until after the trial concludes. Thank you for understanding." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The gallery was packed with community supporters on one side and police officers in civilian clothes on the other. Morrison sat at the defense table with his team of 3 expensive lawyers, looking confident and defiant. His lead attorney, Vincent Crawford, was known throughout the state as the lawyer police officers called when they were in serious trouble. He specialized in painting law enforcement officers as heroes who made split-second decisions in dangerous situations, often successfully convincing juries that any mistakes were understandable, given the pressures of the job. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the court to order. She was a no-nonsense former prosecutor who had a reputation for running a tight courtroom. She had reviewed all the evidence in advance and was clearly taking the case seriously. District Attorney Michael Foster stood to give his opening statement. Foster was young for a DA, only 38, but he had built his career prosecuting corruption and civil rights violations. He knew this case could define his legacy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Foster began, "this case is about abuse of power. It's about a police officer who forgot that his job is to protect and serve all citizens, regardless of the color of their skin. The evidence will show that Officer Morrison targeted Zoe Thompson, not because she had committed any crime, but because she was a young black woman walking in a neighborhood he didn't think she belonged in." Foster clicked a remote, and Devon's video began playing on screens throughout the courtroom. Even though most people had seen it before, watching it in the formal setting of a criminal trial gave it new weight. You could hear gasps from the jury as Morrison's aggressive behavior escalated on screen. "This video speaks for itself," Foster continued when the footage ended, "but it's not the only evidence you'll see. We will present testimony from multiple witnesses who saw Officer Morrison's illegal arrest of Ms. Thompson. More importantly, we will show you a pattern of similar behavior stretching back years, involving other victims who were too afraid to speak out until now." Crawford's opening statement painted a very different picture. He portrayed Morrison as a dedicated public servant working in a dangerous job, making quick decisions with incomplete information to protect the community. Officer Morrison had received reports of suspicious activity in that neighborhood, Crawford told the jury. When he encountered Miss Thompson, she was acting in a manner consistent with those reports. Yes, the situation escalated, but that's because Miss Thompson became argumentative and uncooperative. Officer Morrison had to make a judgment call about public safety, and he did what he thought was necessary to maintain order. Crawford was skilled at his job, and he managed to make Morrison's behavior sound almost reasonable, if you ignored the video evidence. He emphasized Morrison's 15-year career and the dangerous situations he had faced protecting the community. "Police officers have to make difficult decisions every day," Crawford concluded. "Sometimes those decisions look harsh when viewed through the lens of a camera phone, but we must remember the context and the pressures these brave men and women face. Officer Morrison is not a criminal. He's a public servant who deserves our respect and understanding." The first witness called by the prosecution was Zoe herself. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment with Rodriguez, practicing how to stay calm under aggressive cross-examination. As she walked to the witness stand, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. Foster guided her through her testimony methodically. Zoe described her daily routine, her walk home from karate class, and the increasingly hostile encounter with Morrison. Her voice remained steady as she recounted even the most traumatic moments. When Officer Morrison grabbed my arm and spun me around, I was scared, Zoe testified. But I knew from my parents' teachings that I had to stay calm and respectful, no matter how wrong his behavior was. I never raised my voice or made any threatening gestures. Foster asked her to describe her feelings during the arrest. I felt helpless, Zoe said quietly. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but I also knew that fighting back would only make things worse. All I could think about was my parents and how worried they would be when they found out I had been arrested. Crawford's cross-examination was aggressive, as Rodriguez had predicted. He tried to suggest that Zoe had been uncooperative and argumentative, pointing to moments in the video where she had tried to explain herself. Ms. Thompson, isn't it true that you continued talking even after Officer Morrison told you to be quiet? Crawford asked. I was trying to provide him with the information he seemed to want, Zoe replied calmly. When he asked what I was doing in the neighborhood, I tried to explain that I lived nearby and was walking home from karate class. But you kept talking even when he told you to stop, correct? I answered his questions as respectfully as I could. I thought that's what he wanted me to do. Crawford tried several different approaches to rattle Zoe, but her karate training had taught her mental discipline as well as physical techniques. She answered each question honestly and directly, never letting his aggressive tone provoke her into anger or defensiveness. The second day of testimony brought a parade of character witnesses for Zoe. Master Kim testified about her dedication and discipline in martial arts training. Her high school principal described her academic achievements and volunteer work. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had witnessed the arrest, spoke about Zoe's kindness and respectful behavior over the years. But the most powerful testimony came from Devin, the teenager who had recorded the arrest. He was nervous on the witness stand, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention in such a formal setting. I knew Zoe from the neighborhood, Devin testified. She helped me with my math homework sometimes when I was struggling. She never asked for nothing in return, just wanted to help. When I saw that cop treating her like she was some kind of criminal, I knew it was wrong. That's why I started recording. Crawford tried to suggest that Devin's video was biased or incomplete, but the footage spoke for itself. Every crucial moment of the encounter was captured clearly, leaving no room for alternative interpretations. The prosecution's case got stronger on the third day when other Morrison victims began testifying. Rodriguez had convinced 5 people to come forward, each describing similar encounters with the officer over the past several years. Tony Rivera, a 22-year-old college student, described being pulled over by Morrison for driving suspiciously in a middle-class neighborhood where his girlfriend lived. Morrison had searched his car without permission and threatened him with arrest when he tried to assert his rights. Angela Washington, a 34-year-old nurse, testified about being stopped by Morrison while jogging in a park. He had accused her of trespassing and detained her for over an hour, only releasing her when other officers arrived and recognized her as a hospital employee they had worked with. Each victim described the same pattern: Morrison targeting people of color in predominantly white neighborhoods, using vague accusations of suspicious behavior to justify increasingly aggressive encounters. Crawford fought hard to keep this testimony out of the trial, arguing that past incidents were irrelevant to the specific charges against Morrison. But Judge Hendricks allowed it, ruling that the pattern evidence was necessary to understand Morrison's state of mind and intentions during his encounter with Zoe. The prosecution's final witness was Detec Tiv Williams, the police officer who had privately supported the investigation. Williams had finally agreed to testify publicly after receiving guarantees about protection from retaliation. I've been a police officer for 20 years, Williams testified. I've seen good cops and bad cops, and I know the difference. What Officer Morrison did to that young woman was not police work. It was abuse of power, plain and simple. Williams described the culture of protection that had allowed Morrison to escape accountability for so long. He testified about supervisors who ignored complaints, internal affairs investigators who asked leading questions designed to exonerate officers, and a union that treated any criticism of police behavior as an attack on law enforcement itself. Good police officers want bad cops removed from the force, Williams said firmly. They make all of us look bad, and they endanger the communities we're supposed to protect. Officer Morrison should have been stopped years ago, Crawford's cross-examination of Williams was brutal. He accused the detective of betraying his fellow officers and suggested that his testimony was motivated by personal animosity toward Morrison. "Isn't it true, Detective Williams, that you and Officer Morrison had previous conflicts over cases you worked together?" Crawford asked. "We disagreed about methods," Williams replied. "I believe in constitutional policing and treating all citizens with respect. Officer Morrison seemed to believe that some people deserve different treatment based on their race." The defense case began on the fourth day of trial. Crawford called several character witnesses for Morrison, including his supervising sergeant and 2 officers who had worked with him for years. They described him as a dedicated police officer who had received commendations for his work, but their testimony felt hollow in the face of the video evidence and the pattern of abuse that had been established. Crawford knew his best hope was to convince the jury that Morrison's actions, while perhaps excessive, didn't rise to the level of criminal behavior. Morrison himself took the stand on the final day of testimony. He was polished and articulate, sticking closely to the story his lawyers had crafted. He portrayed himself as a concerned officer responding to reports of suspicious activity, making reasonable decisions based on the information available to him. "I've dedicated my career to protecting the citizens of this city," Morrison testified. "Sometimes that means making difficult decisions in tense situations. I never intended to harm Ms. Thompson, and I followed standard procedures for investigating suspicious activity." But Morrison's testimony fell apart during Foster's cross-examination. The prosecutor methodically went through the video footage, asking Morrison to justify each escalation of force. Morrison's answers became increasingly defensive and contradictory. "Officer Morrison, can you point to anything in this video that shows Ms. Thompson acting in a threatening manner?" Foster asked. "She was uncooperative and argumentative," Morrison replied. "Arguing is not illegal, is it? Citizens have the right to ask questions and defend themselves verbally, don't they?" Morrison's composure began to crack. "People need to respect police authority. When an officer gives you an instruction, you follow it. Period. Even when that instruction violates constitutional rights?" Crawford objected, but the damage was done. Morrison had revealed his true attitude toward civilian rights and police authority. To him, any questioning of his actions was inherently disrespectful and worthy of punishment. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, both sides knew that the video evidence would be decisive. Crawford did his best to frame Morrison as a scapegoat for broader societal problems, but Foster's case was overwhelming. The community held its breath as the jury began deliberations. For Zoe and her family, everything they had worked for over the past 6 months came down to the decision of 12 citizens who had never met her before this trial. The real test of justice was about to begin. The jury had been deliberating for 6 hours when Judge Hendricks called for a lunch recess. The tension in the courthouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. Supporters filled the hallways, some pacing nervously while others sat in small groups, whispering about what the delay might mean. Zoe sat on a bench outside the courtroom with her parents, trying to eat the sandwich her mother had packed but finding it difficult to swallow. Her stomach was tied in knots, and every time she heard footsteps approaching, her heart raced thinking it might be news from the jury. "Whatever happens, we're proud of you," her father David said quietly, placing his hand on her shoulder. "You've shown incredible strength through all of this." Attorney Rodriguez approached their little group, checking her phone for the 100th time that day. "Jury deliberations can be unpredictable," she reminded them. "Sometimes a quick verdict means they found the evidence overwhelming. Sometimes a long deliberation means they're being thorough. There's no way to know until they come back." Across the hallway, Morrison sat with his wife and 2 teenage sons. His family looked exhausted and worried, and Zoe felt a moment of sympathy for them despite everything their husband and father had put her through. She had never wanted to destroy a family. She just wanted justice and accountability. Morrison caught her looking in his direction, and their eyes met for a brief moment. Instead of the hatred or defiance she expected to see, there was something else in his expression. Desperation maybe, or fear. The confident, aggressive officer who had arrested her 6 months ago looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of public scrutiny and legal consequences. "I need to use the restroom," Zoe told her parents, standing up from the bench. "I'll be right back." The courthouse restrooms were located down a long hallway away from the main crowd. As Zoe walked toward them, She noticed that the hallway was unusually quiet. Most people were either in the cafeteria or outside smoking cigarettes during the break. She pushed open the door to the women's restroom and was surprised to find it empty. The silence felt peaceful after hours of crowd noise and tension. She splashed cool water on her face and looked at herself in the mirror, trying to center herself the way Master Kim had taught her. When she emerged from the restroom a few minutes later, Morrison was waiting in the hallway. He had positioned himself between Zoe and the main corridor, blocking her path back to where her parents were waiting. They were alone, and the nearest other people were at least 50 yards away. "We need to talk," Morrison said, his voice low and urgent. Zoe felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression calm. "I don't think that's appropriate, Officer Morrison. Our lawyers should handle any communication." Morrison stepped closer, and Zoe could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. His usual composure was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like panic. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice getting louder. "You're destroying my life over nothing. I was just doing my job that day. You were acting suspicious, and I had to check it out." Zoe remained perfectly still, using the breathing techniques from her martial arts training to stay calm. She could sense that Morrison was becoming increasingly agitated, and she knew that any sudden movement might trigger an even more dangerous reaction. "Officer Morrison, I understand you're upset, but this isn't the place for this conversation. Please step aside so I can return to my family." "Your family?" Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. "You think your family matters more than mine? I've got 2 kids who are getting harassed at school because of you. My wife can't even go to the grocery store without people staring at her. You've turned me into some kind of monster, and for what?" Zoe could see that Morrison was working himself into a rage, but she also noticed something else. There was a security camera mounted high on the wall behind him, and a red light indicated it was recording. Whatever happened in this hallway would be captured on video, just like their original encounter. "I didn't turn you into anything," Zoe replied calmly. "I was just walking home from karate class when you decided to arrest me for no reason. Everything that's happened since then has been a result of your choices, not mine." Morrison's face flushed red. "My choices? You're the one who had to make a big deal out of everything. You could have just taken the arrest and moved on with your life. Instead, you had to get lawyers involved and drag me through the mud on social media. I had the right to defend myself," Zoe said firmly, "just like you had the right to a fair trial. The difference is that I actually did something wrong. You didn't." "Shut up," Morrison shouted, his voice echoing off the hallway walls. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think because you got some fancy lawyer and a bunch of protesters on your side that you're better than me?" Morrison moved closer, backing Zoe against the wall. She could smell coffee on his breath and see the desperation in his eyes. This was a man who had built his identity around having power over others, and that power was slipping away. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Girl," Morrison growled, using the same dismissive tone he had used during their original encounter. "I've been a cop in this city for 15 years. I know people. I have connections. Even if this jury convicts me, I'll make sure you pay for what you've done to me." The threat was clear, and Zoe felt a chill run down her spine. But she also felt something else, a calm determinati. On that came from months of preparation and years of martial arts training. She was not the same scared teenager who had been arrested on Maple Street. She had found her voice and her strength. "Are you threatening me, Officer Morrison?" she asked quietly. "I'm telling you the truth," Morrison replied. "You think this ends when the trial is over? You think you can just go back to your normal life? I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I'll make sure no college wants you. No employer will hire you. You'll regret the day you decided to mess with me." Morrison reached out and grabbed Zoe's arm, the same way he had during her arrest. But this time Zoe was ready for him. Her years of karate training had taught her to read body language and anticipate attacks. She had seen the grab coming from his posture and the positioning of his feet. "Let go of me," Zoe said firmly. "Or what?" Morrison sneered. "You'll call your lawyer? You'll cry to your parents. You're just a teenager and I'm a police officer. Nobody's going to believe that I threatened you." Morrison tightened his grip on Zoe's arm and pushed her harder against the wall. "You need to learn some respect," he said, his face inches from hers. "You need to understand that there are consequences for disrespecting authority." That's when Morrison made his final mistake. He drew back his free hand as if to strike her, and Zoe's training took over completely. Master Kim had drilled into all his students that martial arts should only be used for self-defense. But when genuine self-defense was necessary, they should act decisively. Zoe used a basic technique she had learned in her first year of training. She grabbed Morrison's wrist with both hands, stepped to the side, and used his own momentum against him as she twisted his arm. The move was designed to break an attacker's grip and create distance, not to cause injury. Morrison, who was off balance from his aggressive posture, stumbled forward and fell hard to the floor. He landed awkwardly on his side, his expensive suit jacket tearing as he slid across the polished linoleum. "What the hell?" Morrison shouted as he struggled to get up. "Did you just assault a police officer?" "I defended myself from someone who was threatening and grabbing me," Zoe replied calmly. "The same thing I would do if anyone else tried to hurt me." Morrison's shouts had attracted attention from the main corridor. Security guards came rushing down the hallway, followed by several reporters who had been covering the trial. Morrison was still on the ground, his face red with embarrassment and rage. "She attacked me," Morrison yelled at the security guards. "I want her arrested for assaulting a police officer." But the head security guard, an older man named Frank, who had been working courthouse security for over 20 years, had seen what happened on the hallway camera monitors. He had watched Morrison corner Zoe, threaten her, and grab her arm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down," Frank told Morrison firmly. "From what I saw on the cameras, the young lady was defending herself after you initiated physical contact." Rodriguez appeared at the end of the hallway, having been alerted by the commotion. She took in the scene quickly. Morrison on the ground, Zoe standing calmly against the wall, security guards trying to restore order, and reporters scribbling notes furiously. "Mr. Morrison, what exactly happened here?" Rodriguez asked. Morrison struggled to his feet, brushing dust off his torn jacket. "I was trying to have a private conversation with your client, and she attacked me for no reason." "Is that what happened, Zoe?" Rodriguez asked. Zoe nodded toward the security camera. "Everything that happened is recorded up there. Officer Morrison cornered me in this hallway, threatened me and my future, grabbed my arm, and appeared to be about to strike me. I used a basic self-defense technique to get away from him." Frank, the security guard, confirmed Zoe's account. "I watched the whole thing on the monitors. The officer initiated all the physical contact. The young lady only acted after he grabbed her and appeared to be escalating to violence." Rodriguez turned to Morrison with a look of amazement. "You threatened and physically confronted my client during jury deliberations in your own criminal trial? Are you completely out of your mind?" Morrison realized that his outburst had been captured on camera and witnessed by multiple people. The same technology that had exposed his original abuse of Zoe had now documented his attempts to intimidate her during his trial. "I was just trying to talk to her," Morrison said weakly. "I wanted her to understand how this whole thing has affected my family." "By threatening her future and grabbing her arm?" Rodriguez asked incredulously. "Officer Morrison, you just provided the prosecution with additional evidence of your character and your propensity for targeting my client." District Attorney Foster appeared in the hallway, alerted by his staff about the incident. When he learned what had happened, he immediately requested that the courthouse security footage be preserved as evidence. "This is witness intimidation and assault," Foster told the assembled group. "Officer Morrison just committed new crimes while on trial for his previous crimes against the same victim." Morrison's defense attorney Crawford arrived moments later, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His client had just destroyed any remaining chance of acquittal by demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior he was on trial for. "My client was clearly emotional and not thinking." "Clearly," Crawford said desperately. "This was an isolated incident brought on by the stress of the trial." "An isolated incident?" Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "Officer Morrison has now physically confronted my client twice. Once when he illegally arrested her, and now when he tried to intimidate her during his trial. This is a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident." As the crowd in the hallway grew larger, Zoe remained calm and centered. She had defended herself appropriately and legally, and she knew that Morrison's behavior had just sealed his fate. Any jury that learned about his attempt to intimidate a teenage witness would have no choice but to convict him. Morrison stood in the hallway looking defeated, finally understanding that his career in law enforcement was over. More than that, he was likely facing additional criminal charges for his actions today. The confrontation that Morrison had initiated to intimidate Zoe had backfired completely. Instead of silencing her, he had provided even more evidence of his unfitness to be a police officer. And instead of making her look bad, he had demonstrated her remarkable composure and self-control under pressure. As courthouse security escorted Morrison away from Zoe, she felt a sense of completion. She had faced her abuser twice now, and both times she had emerged stronger and more confident. Whatever the jury decided, she knew she had done everything right. The final chapter of Officer Morrison's career was about to be written, and it would not be the ending he had hoped for. Word of Morrison's hallway confrontation with Zoe spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By the time court reconvened after lunch, every reporter, supporter, and court officer knew what had happened. The security footage had been reviewed by both legal teams, and there was no disputing what it showed. Judge Hendricks was furious when she learned about the incident. She immediately called both attorneys to her chambers for an emergency conference, leaving the packed courtroom buzzing with anticipation. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Hendricks said sternly once the lawyers were seated in her office, "your client just committed witness intimidation and assault in my courthouse, while his jury was deliberating his fate. This is beyond unacceptable." Crawford looked like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. "Your Honor, my client is under enormous stress. His entire career and livelihood are at stake. While his actions were inappropriate, I don't think they rise to the level of—" "Don't," Judge Hendricks cut him off. "I watched the security footage myself. Your client cornered a teenage witness, threatened her future, and grabbed her aggressively. If she hadn't defended herself, the situation could have escalated to serious violence." District Attorney Foster leaned forward in his chair. "Your Honor, the state requests that additional charges be filed against Officer Morrison for witness intimidation, assault, and violation of his bail conditions. His behavior demonstrates exactly the pattern of abuse that this trial has been about." Judge Hendricks nodded grimly. "I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Crawford, your client will be taken into custody immediately after this trial concludes, regardless of the jury's verdict. His bail is revoked effective immediately." When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Hendricks addressed the packed gallery before bringing the jury back in. "There has been an incident during the lunch recess that I need to address," she announced. "The defendant approached the victim in this case without his attorney present and engaged in behavior that constitutes witness intimidation. Security footage of this incident will be preserved, and additional charges will be filed." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Morrison sat at the defense table looking defeated, while Zoe maintained her composure in the front row next to her parents. "I want to be clear," Judge Hendricks continued, "that this incident has no bearing on the charges currently before the jury. They will make their decision based solely on the evidence presented during the trial. However, I am revoking the defendant's bail, and he will be taken into custody at the conclusion of these proceedings." Two bailiffs moved to positions near Morrison, making it clear that he would not be leaving the courthouse as a free man regardless of the verdict. The jury was brought back into the courtroom, and their foreman announced that they had reached a verdict. The lead juror was a middle-aged black woman named Carol Washington who worked as a high school teacher. She had been elected foreman by her fellow jurors and had taken the responsibility seriously. "Has the jury reached a verdict on all counts?" Judge Hendricks asked. "We have, Your Honor," Washington replied, holding the verdict forms with steady hands. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Zoe felt her heart pounding as she waited to learn whether 6 months of legal battles had been worth it. "On the charge of assault and battery, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." A cheer went up from the gallery before Judge Hendricks gavelled for order. Morrison's shoulders sagged as he heard the word that ended his law enforcement career. "On the charge of violation of civil rights under color of law, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The cheering was louder this time. Zoe felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief and vindication rather than sadness. "On the charge of filing a false police report, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Judge Hendricks gavelled repeatedly for order, but she didn't seem particularly upset by the celebration. Morrison had been convicted on all counts by a jury of his peers. Crawford immediately requested that his client be allowed to remain free pending sentencing, but Judge Hendricks denied the motion. Given the defendant's behavior today, including his attempt to intimidate the victim in this case, I find that he poses a continued threat to public safety. He will remain in custody until sentencing. Morrison was handcuffed and led away by the bailiffs as his wife and children watched from the gallery. For the first time since this ordeal began, Zoe felt genuinely sorry for Morrison's family. They were innocent victims of his choices, and their lives had been destroyed along with his. The jury deliberation had taken just under 7 hours. But afterward, several jurors spoke to reporters about their decision-making process. Carol Washington, the foreman, explained that the video evidence had been overwhelming. "We watched that footage over and over," Washington told the crowd of reporters outside the courthouse. "There was no question that Officer Morrison had abused his authority and violated that young woman's rights." The other victims who testified showed us that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior. Another juror, a retired electrician named Bob Miller, added his perspective. "I went into this trial thinking we needed to support our police officers. And we do. We need to support the good ones by getting rid of the bad ones. Officer Morrison was clearly one of the bad ones." The most powerful statement came from Maria Santos, a mother of 3 who worked as a school administrator. "When I watched that video, I saw my own daughter. I saw any young person who could be targeted just for walking down the street. What Officer Morrison did was wrong, and it had to have consequences." 3 weeks later, Morrison returned to court for sentencing. In the intervening time, additional charges had been filed for his confrontation with Zoe in the courthouse hallway. He had pled guilty to those charges on the advice of his attorney, hoping for leniency. The sentencing hearing drew another large crowd. Zoe was allowed to give a victim impact statement before Judge Hendricks announced Morrison's punishment. "When Officer Morrison arrested me 6 months ago, he told me I needed to learn respect for authority," Zoe said, reading from prepared remarks. "But what I learned was that real authority comes from earning respect, not demanding it through fear and intimidation." She looked directly at Morrison as she continued. "I hope that Officer Morrison's conviction sends a message to other police officers that they work for the community, not the other way around. The badge and uniform don't give anyone the right to abuse people who look different or come from different backgrounds." Zoe concluded her statement by addressing Morrison directly. "I forgive you for what you did to me, Officer Morrison, but forgiveness doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. I hope you use your time in prison to think about the kind of person you want to be when you get out." Morrison's attorney presented character witnesses and asked for the minimum sentence, arguing that his client had already lost his career and reputation. But Judge Hendricks was unmoved. "Officer Morrison violated the most fundamental trust placed in law enforcement," she said before announcing the sentence. "Citizens must be able to trust that police officers will protect their rights, not violate them. When that trust is broken, the consequences must be severe enough to deter others from similar behavior." Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in prison on the original charges, plus an additional 18 months for the courthouse incident. He was also banned from working in law, enforcement for life, and ordered to pay restitution to Zoe for her legal fees and emotional distress. The civil lawsuit that Rodriguez had filed proceeded separately and was settled out of court for $2.3 million. The city also agreed to implement new training programs for police officers and establish an independent civilian oversight board to investigate complaints of misconduct. Zoe used part of her settlement money to establish the Justice and Respect Foundation, which provided scholarships for underprivileged youth to participate in martial arts programs. The foundation also funded legal assistance for victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford attorneys. Master Kim's karate studio became the first recipient of foundation funding, allowing him to offer free classes to children from low-income families. The program emphasized not just physical training, but character development and understanding of legal rights. Zoe's experience taught us that physical strength is important, but moral strength is even more important, Master Kim explained at the foundation's launch event. "We want these children to be able to defend themselves, but we also want them to understand justice and respect for all people." Zoe graduated from high school as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to attend law school at Harvard University. Her college essay about her experience with the justice system had impressed admissions committees across the country. During her first year of law school, Zoe often thought about the afternoon on Maple Street that had changed her life. What had started as a walk home from karate class had become a journey toward understanding the law and her own power to create change. She kept in touch with Devon, the teenager whose video had captured Morrison's abuse. He had been inspired by Zoe's example to pursue a career in journalism, and he was attending community college while working part-time at the local newspaper. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had witnessed Zoe's arrest, became one of the foundation's biggest supporters. She organized fundraising events in the community and often spoke about how Zoe's courage had inspired her to become more involved in civil rights issues. Detective Williams, the police officer who had testified against Morrison, was promoted to sergeant and assigned to lead the department's new community relations unit. He implemented many of the reforms that Zoe and Rodriguez had advocated for during the trial. 2 years after Morrison's conviction, Zoe was invited to speak at the police academy graduation ceremony. Standing at the podium in front of 150 new officers, she thought about how far she had come from that scared teenager on Maple Street. "You have chosen a profession that gives you enormous power over other people's lives," she told the graduating class. "That power is a privilege, not a right. Use it to protect and serve all citizens equally, regardless of their race, background, or economic status." She concluded her speech with a challenge. "Don't be like Rick Morrison, be better. Be the kind of police officer who earns respect through fairness and professionalism. Be someone who makes your community proud to have you wearing the badge." After the ceremony, many of the new officers approached Zoe to thank her for her words. Several told her that they had been inspired to join law enforcement specifically because they wanted to be part of the solution to problems like police misconduct. Chief Anderson, who had replaced the previous chief after Morrison's conviction, shook Zoe's hand warmly. "You've done more to improve policing in this city than most people accomplish in a lifetime," he told her. "Thank you for fighting for justice instead of just seeking revenge." As Zoe drove home from the academy that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The confrontation with Morrison in the courthouse hallway had been the turning point, the moment when she realized that standing up to bullies sometimes required more than just words. Her karate training had given her the physical skills to defend herself, but more importantly, it had given her the mental discipline to stay calm under pressure and the moral framework to know when self-defense was necessary. Morrison had served 3 years of his sentence when Zoe read in the newspaper that he was being released on parole. She felt a momentary flutter of anxiety, but it passed quickly. She was no longer the scared teenager he had arrested on Maple Street. She was a law student, a foundation director, and an advocate for justice. If Morrison had learned from his time in prison and was ready to become a better person, she wished him well. If he hadn't learned, then the system would be watching him, and people like her would be ready to hold him accountable. The little girl who had started taking karate classes to build confidence had grown into a young woman who was changing the world. And it all started with a simple walk home from the dojo on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Zoe had discovered that real justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a better future for everyone.